The laughter hit Mira Bennett before the words did. I was sitting 2 rows behind her when it started, and I remember thinking that the sound of alien laughter is strange to a human ear, high and clicking, like stones tapping together. She did not turn around. She did not flinch. She kept her eyes on the display in front of her, where a holographic chart of nervous systems rotated slowly, and she let the laughter roll over her like weather. My name is Kess. I am a Doran, which means I have 4 eyes, thin gray skin, and a species-wide reputation for being cautious to the point of cowardice. I tell you this because it matters. On our homeworld, nothing hunts us. Nothing has hunted us for 10,000 years. We are careful because we have never needed to be brave. Humans are different. Everyone in the galaxy knows this, or thinks they do. The instructor, a tall insectoid named Vashtu, had just finished explaining that Earth was classified as a Deathworld, a planet where the environment itself tried to kill its inhabitants every single day, weather that turned deadly without warning. Predators at every level of the food chain, including things too small to see, diseases, earthquakes, even the air pressure and gravity were listed as hostile by galactic standards. Threll, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed and his chitin plates gleaming under the classroom lights, thought this was hilarious. So basically, he said, loud enough for the whole room, humans survived their planet by being lucky, not strong, not smart. Lucky explains a lot, actually. A few students laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Threll was popular in the way that loud, confident people often are, regardless of species, and his opinions had a way of becoming the room's opinions if nobody pushed back. He turned around in his seat, looking directly at Mira. "No offense," he said, in the tone people use right before offending someone, "but you're proof of the theory. You barely talk. You jump at loud noises. I watched you drop your tray in the dining hall because someone laughed too loud behind you. If your species is supposed to be tough, you didn't get the memo." Mira still did not look up. Her fingers were resting on the edge of her desk, completely still. I want to describe what I saw next carefully, because at the time I thought nothing of it, and it turned out to be the most important detail of the entire day. Her eyes moved. Not her head, just her eyes, flicking once to the door on the left side of the room, then to the window, then to the emergency panel near the ceiling, then back to the holographic chart, as if nothing had happened. It took less than 2 seconds. I only noticed because I happened to be looking at her when it occurred. I did not know then that this was a habit, a reflex, something her species does without deciding to do it, the way my own eyes automatically track sudden movement even when I am half asleep. Humans, I would later learn, are always quietly counting their exits, always, even in a classroom, even while being mocked by a boy with a shell-like armor. "Leave her alone, Threll," said Orin, a Velkari girl with pale blue scales who sat near me. She said it gently, the way you might correct a puppy, not because she disagreed with him, but because she found the whole exchange a little embarrassing to watch. "I'm not being mean," Threll said, holding up his claws in mock innocence. "I'm being honest. There's a difference. Someone should tell her species the truth. You come out here to the wider galaxy, you meet species who can breathe vacuum, regenerate limbs, survive temperatures that would boil water instantly, and you're worried about running into a large dog. It's almost sweet." More laughter. Vashtu, our instructor, made a half-hearted attempt to move the lesson along, but even she seemed to find the exchange more entertaining than educational, and she let it continue a moment longer than she should have. I leaned toward Mira, mostly out of curiosity, and mostly because I did not like the way the room felt. "You all right?" I asked quietly. She glanced at me. Her eyes were a plain brown, the kind of color that exists on 100 worlds, nothing remarkable about them at all, except for the way they seemed to be doing 3 things at once. Watching me, watching the room, watching something else entirely, something I could not name yet. "I'm fine," she said. 2 words, that was the most I had heard her say in the 6 weeks since the term began. Vashtu finally reclaimed control of the lesson, tapping her mandibles together for attention, and the class chart shifted to a new image, this one showing predator adaptations across different biomes. She explained that today's practical session would take place off-campus, at a nearby wildlife reserve maintained by the Academy, where students could observe controlled specimens in a semi-natural habitat. Completely safe, she added, when a Velkari boy near the back asked whether the reserve held anything dangerous. The specimens are sedated on a rotating schedule, the perimeter fencing is triple redundant, and a full medical team will accompany us. This is a routine field exercise, nothing to be nervous about. Threll smirked and glanced back at Mira one more time. Good, he said. Should be easy then. Even for someone who's scared of loud noises. I watched Mira's jaw tighten, just slightly, the only visible reaction she allowed herself. She did not answer him. She simply reached down, picked up her stylus, which had rolled slightly off her desk, and set it back in its place with a precision that seemed almost unnecessary for such a small object. Class ended a few minutes later. Students filed out in loud, overlapping conversations, comparing notes on the upcoming trip, speculating about what animals the reserve might hold, joking about which of us would faint first at the sight of a large creature. Threll walked past Mira's desk and knocked her stylus case to the floor, not quite by accident, not quite on purpose, the kind of thing that could be laughed off as clumsiness if anyone challenged him on it. Mira bent down, picked it up without a word, and slid it into her bag. I stayed behind for a moment, unsure why. Maybe curiosity, maybe some instinct of my own, quieter and less developed than hers, telling me that there was more to this human than the class assumed. You know, I said, you don't have to let him talk to you like that. She looked at me for a long moment. Not with anger, not with sadness either, something closer to calculation, as if she were deciding whether I was worth a real answer or another two-word deflection. He doesn't know what he's talking about, she said finally. That's fine. Most people don't. What do you mean? She slung her bag over her shoulder and stood, and for the first time I noticed something about the way she moved, a kind of economy to it. No wasted motion, no extra steps. It was subtle. It was the sort of thing you would only catch if you happened to be paying very close attention, which, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I was. Deathworld isn't an insult, she said. It's a warning label, for everyone else. She walked out before I could ask what she meant, and I stood there in the empty classroom, replaying her eyes flicking to the door, the window, the panel near the ceiling, and wondering, for the first time, whether the galaxy had made a serious mistake in deciding what humans were. I did not know yet how quickly I would find out. The transport to the reserve left 3 hours later, a sleek shuttle with enough seats for the entire xenobiology class plus 2 chaperones and a small security detail that nobody expected to actually use their equipment. I ended up sitting across the aisle from Mira, mostly because Oren had saved a seat for Threll and his friends, and the only open row left was next to the quiet human girl nobody wanted to sit beside. She had a small satchel with her, the kind students carry for field notes, and she spent the ride checking its contents methodically. Notebook, stylus, a water flask, a small multi-tool standard academy issue that most students never bothered to take out of their bags at all. She checked it anyway. She checked the flask was sealed properly. She checked the strap on her satchel twice. You always this careful? I asked, unable to help myself. You always this curious, she replied, but there was the faintest suggestion of something at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but close. I don't usually talk to people who don't talk, I admitted. But you looked at 3 exits in a classroom that has never had an emergency in the history of the academy. That's not normal caution, that's something else. Her eyes flicked to me, sharper now, more attentive than they had been all day. You noticed that. I notice things. It's a Doran trait. We're not brave, but we're careful, and careful people notice careful people. She was quiet for a moment, watching the passing landscape through the shuttle window, low hills covered in unfamiliar purple vegetation, the kind of scenery that looked peaceful and probably was, at least on the surface. "Where I grew up," she said slowly, "you always know where the doors are. You always know what's around you. Not because something is definitely going to happen, because you don't get a warning when it does. Earth sounds exhausting." "It's home," she said simply, and there was no complaint in her voice at all, only a kind of quiet acceptance that I found strangely unsettling. You get used to paying attention. After a while, you don't even notice you're doing it. It just becomes part of how you sit in a room. Across the aisle, Threll was recounting some story to his friends about a hunting simulation he had aced last term, his claws gesturing wide to illustrate the size of a virtual creature he claimed to have outmaneuvered. Nobody was listening to us. Nobody cared what the quiet human girl and the cautious Doran boy were murmuring about near the back. "Do you actually think something's going to happen today?" I asked, lowering my voice further. Mira considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. "I think," she said, "that a facility can call itself completely safe as many times as it wants. That doesn't make it true. It just means nobody there has been wrong yet." The shuttle began its descent a few minutes later, the reserve coming into view below us, a wide stretch of managed wilderness surrounded by fencing that gleamed faintly with the telltale shimmer of an active containment field. Structures dotted the perimeter, observation platforms, a visitor center, small maintenance buildings. From the air, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a controlled environment, a safe place for students to observe dangerous things from a comfortable distance. I looked at Mira one more time before the shuttle touched down. She was watching the fence line with the same flat, careful attention she had given the classroom door that morning, and I realized, with a small chill I could not fully explain, that she was not looking at the scenery at all. She was counting exits again. The reserve smelled like wet stone and unfamiliar plants, and the moment we stepped off the shuttle, a guide was waiting for us, with the kind of professional smile that people wear when they have said the same welcome speech 1,000 times before. His name tag read Colin, and he was human, which surprised me a little. Most reserve staff on this world were Velkari, since the planet's climate suited them well, but Colin had apparently transferred here 2 years ago from a similar facility on a different world entirely. He had an easy, friendly manner, the kind that put nervous students at ease immediately, gesturing for us to gather near the visitor center while he ran through the safety briefing. "Welcome to the Aldrin Reserve," he said, spreading his arms toward the wide green landscape behind him. "Home to over 40 species of native and imported fauna, all carefully monitored, all completely secure behind our perimeter field. You are, without exception, in the safest possible place to observe genuine Deathworld-adjacent predator behavior up close." A ripple of murmurs went through the class. Deathworld-adjacent. The phrase alone made several students glance nervously toward the tree line beyond the fence, half expecting something enormous to come crashing through it on cue. "Relax," Colin said, laughing. "Nothing in this reserve has broken containment in 3 years of operation. Our fencing runs on triple redundant power, our tranquilizer schedule is managed automatically, and every guide carries an emergency recall device that can subdue any animal on the property within 4 seconds. You are going to have an interesting afternoon, not a dangerous one." Threll, predictably, looked disappointed by this. He had clearly been hoping for something closer to danger than to education. "Boring," he muttered to Oren, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I thought this was supposed to be a Deathworld exercise, not a petting zoo." Colin either didn't hear him or chose not to react, and led the group along a raised wooden walkway that wound between enclosures. The first stop was a viewing platform overlooking a wide, grassy paddock where several large, 6-legged herbivores grazed peacefully, their long necks bending low to reach clumps of purple grass. "These are bellowbacks," Colin explained, "native to a moon 2 systems over, harmless, despite the size, purely herbivorous, though they can deliver quite a kick if startled. Notice how they keep their heads low and their group tight. That's herd behavior, an adaptation against predators." The class dutifully took notes, snapped a few hollow images, and moved along the walkway to the next enclosure. I noticed Mira lingering slightly behind the rest of the group, her eyes tracking not the bellowbacks but the fence line itself, running her gaze along the shimmer of the containment field, as if checking for something out of place. "See something?" I asked, falling into step beside her. "No," she said. "That's the problem." "What do you mean?" She nodded subtly toward a maintenance panel set into the base of the fence, about 30 meters ahead. A small indicator light on it was blinking amber instead of the steady green visible on the other panels we had passed. "That light's different," she said. "Everyone else's is green. That one's amber." I squinted at it. She was right. I would never have noticed on my own, but now that she had pointed it out, the difference was obvious. A small warning quietly blinking away, while a guide with a friendly voice told us there was nothing to worry about. "Maybe it's just due for maintenance," I offered. "Maybe," Mira said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. We caught up to the rest of the group, as Colin led them toward the next enclosure, a denser, more forested section of the reserve, where something large moved among the shadows of tall purple-leafed trees. "This next habitat houses one of our more impressive residents," Colin announced, his voice dropping into the practiced cadence of someone building anticipation. "A Caro stalker, imported from a genuine Deathworld classification 3 systems out. Apex predator on its home planet, adapted for both speed and endurance, capable of tracking prey for extended periods without rest. Completely sedated on our rotation schedule, of course, and kept well fed so it has no reason to view visitors as anything but scenery." The class pressed toward the railing, eager for a glimpse. Through gaps in the foliage, I caught sight of something dark, low, and powerful, moving with a fluid, unhurried grace despite its size. Even from a distance, even through the shimmer of the containment field, something about its movement made the fine hairs on my arms stand up, a Doran instinct so old it predated language. Threll leaned over the railing, delighted. "Now this is more like it," he said. "Finally something worth the trip." Mira did not move toward the railing at all. She stood a few paces back, her satchel strap gripped in one hand, watching the amber light on the distant fence panel rather than the creature everyone else had come to see. "You're not even looking at it," Threll said, noticing her and unable to resist the opportunity. "Scared, quiet girl? It's behind a field. It can't get to you." "I'm sure it can't," Mira said evenly, not rising to the bait. Colin continued his lecture, describing the stalker's hunting adaptations, its heat-sensing organs, its ability to detect prey through several centimeters of solid rock, its jaw strength, its stamina. The class listened, fascinated, snapping images, murmuring to each other, thoroughly absorbed in the spectacle of a genuine apex predator held safely at bay by human and Velkari engineering. I found myself watching Mira instead of the stalker. She had drifted closer to me, her eyes still tracking the amber panel, then the walkway behind us, then the nearest exit path back toward the visitor center, cataloging the same information over and over, as if building a map that the rest of us didn't know we needed. "Does it bother you?" I asked quietly. "Watching something like that?" "No," she said. "What bothers me is that nobody else is watching the fence." A low, distant hum caught my attention then, a mechanical whine that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the walkway, followed by a brief flicker in the amber light, which blinked twice and then steadied into a dull, unbroken red. Mira's head turned instantly, fully, no longer the subtle sideways glance she had used all day, her whole body oriented toward the fence like a compass needle finding north. "Colin," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through his lecture, "your fence panel just changed to red." The guide paused mid-sentence, blinking at her, clearly unused to being interrupted by a student, let alone one who had barely spoken a word all afternoon. "I'm sorry?" "The panel," Mira said again, pointing toward it, her voice calm but firm. 30 meters that way. It went from green to amber to red just now. "That's not a maintenance signal. That's a fault indicator." Colin frowned and pulled a small device from his belt, tapping at its screen with visible confusion. For a moment, the reassuring, practiced ease he had carried all afternoon slipped, just slightly, replaced by something tighter around his eyes. "That's odd," he said. "Let me just check the central system." He tapped at his device again, and this time his frown deepened into something closer to concern. "The central system is showing full function across the board," he said, more to himself than to us. "But that panel's a physical indicator, hardwired, not networked. It shouldn't be able to show a fault the main system doesn't see." "Which means," Threll asked, some of his earlier confidence draining from his voice. "Which means," Colin said slowly, "there might be a problem the main system can't detect yet." A ripple of unease moved through the class, students glancing at each other, at the fence, at the shadowed enclosure where the Caro stalker's dark shape still moved with that same unhurried, fluid grace among the trees. "I'm going to call this in," Colin said, forcing his voice back into something calm and professional. "In the meantime, everyone stay well back from the railing. This is almost certainly nothing, but we follow procedure regardless." He turned away, speaking quietly into his device, and the class shuffled backward from the railing, murmuring nervously among themselves. Threll, to his credit, did not make a joke this time. I looked at Mira. She had not moved. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the enclosure, on the shimmer of the containment field that separated 40 students from an apex predator built by an entire Deathworld's worth of evolutionary pressure. "Mira," I said quietly, "the light's red, not the field itself. The field's still up, right?" "For now," she said. "What do you mean, for now?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and unclipped the small multi-tool from her satchel, turning it over once in her fingers before tucking it into her jacket pocket, close at hand, the same unhurried, economical movement I had noticed on the shuttle that morning. "Fences fail," she said finally. "Every fence, on every world, given enough time and enough bad luck. The people who built this one know that. That's why they have backups, and backups for the backups." "That sounds reassuring." "It should be," Mira said, her eyes still locked on the shimmering field, on the dark shape moving steadily closer to its edge, as if it too had noticed something the rest of us had not. "Except backups fail in threes far more often than anyone likes to admit." Colin's voice rose sharply behind us, no longer calm, no longer practiced, cutting through the murmur of the class like a blade. "Everyone, back toward the visitor center. Right now, this is not a drill." The words were still leaving his mouth when the shimmer of the containment field flickered once, twice, and went dark. For one full second, nobody moved. 40 students and 2 adults stood frozen on a wooden walkway, staring at the place where a wall of invisible energy had been holding back an apex predator a heartbeat before, and was no longer there at all. Then the Caro stalker stepped out of the trees, into the open, and looked directly at us. And Mira Bennett, the quiet human girl nobody had bothered to notice all term, was already moving before anyone else had finished screaming. Screaming broke out along the walkway, a chaotic wave of sound as 40 students from a dozen different species reacted in a dozen different ways. Some froze completely, limbs locked, eyes wide, the way prey animals do when a predator's gaze finally lands on them. Others turned and ran in whatever direction seemed farthest from the enclosure, colliding with each other, knocking over equipment, adding to the confusion rather than escaping it. Oren had grabbed the railing so hard her scales had paled from the pressure. Threll had gone completely silent, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found, his claws frozen halfway through a gesture he never finished making. I felt my own body lock up in the particular, useless way that Dorans freeze when frightened, a species-wide reflex built for a homeworld with no predators, entirely unsuited for a moment like this one. My mind understood, distantly, that standing still was the wrong choice. My body did not care what my mind understood. Mira moved like none of that applied to her at all. She did not run, she did not freeze. In the space of perhaps 2 seconds, I watched something happen to her that I still find difficult to describe accurately, even now, even having seen it firsthand. Her shoulders, which had been slightly hunched all day, in the posture of someone trying not to be noticed, dropped and squared. Her breathing, which I only noticed because I happened to be standing close enough, slowed rather than quickened, long and even, the opposite of what panic should have produced. Her eyes, which had spent the whole day flicking quietly between exits and warning signs, went flat and focused, tracking the stalker's movement with an intensity that had nothing hesitant left in it at all. "Colin," she said, and her voice, calm and clear, cut through the screaming like it had its own gravity. "How far can the recall device reach?" Colin, to his credit, was already fumbling for the small device at his belt, but his hands were shaking badly enough that he nearly dropped it. 30 meters, he said. Maybe less if the main power grid is compromised along with the fence. "It's 40 meters away and closing," Mira said. "You won't get a clean shot before it's inside your range anyway. Don't waste the charge trying." "Then what do we—" "Get everyone moving toward the visitor center," Mira said, already turning toward the panicked crowd of students behind her. "Not running, moving. Running triggers chase response in almost anything with a predatory nervous system. Walking fast, staying together, does not. I do not know how she knew that. I do not think, in that moment, she was drawing on some academy lecture or a memorized fact from a textbook. It came out of her the way breathing comes out of a person. Automatic, unquestioned, older than conscious thought. "Everyone, listen to her," Colin said, his voice cracking slightly, but carrying the authority of an adult, desperate for someone else's confidence to lean on. "Move toward the visitor center. Stay together. Do not run." The class, shocked into something resembling obedience by the sheer strangeness of being commanded by two people at once, began to shuffle backward along the walkway, some students crying, others simply staring at the Caro stalker with the particular horror of creatures who have never needed to think about being eaten before. The stalker did not charge, not yet. It moved instead in a slow, deliberate arc along the tree line, parallel to our retreat, its dark, heat-sensing eyes tracking each of us in turn, unhurried, patient, the way something moves when it has all the time in the world and knows its prey has none. "It's hurting us," Mira said quietly, mostly to herself, though I heard her. "Hurting us where?" I asked, my voice higher than I intended. She scanned the walkway ahead, the tree line to our left, the steep drop of the paddock fence to our right, and I watched her mind work through the geometry of the trap, the way I might work through a simple equation, except the variables were our lives. "Toward the narrow section," she said, "where the walkway pinches between the fence and the observation tower. It's a bottleneck. Easier to isolate someone there." "How do you know that?" "Because it's what I would do," she said, and something about the flat, practical honesty of that answer chilled me more than the predator itself had. Threll, several paces ahead of us, stumbled against the railing, his claws scrabbling for balance, and for one terrible second he was closer to the enclosure's broken edge than anyone else in the group. The stalker's head turned toward him immediately, its posture shifting, weight settling low and forward, the unmistakable stance of something that had just chosen its target. "Threll, move left, now," Mira said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his panic. He did not move. His body had locked the same way mine had, the same way half the classes had, caught in that useless, ancient freeze that worked perfectly well on a world with no predators and meant absolutely nothing here. Mira was already moving toward him before I fully registered what was happening. She crossed the distance between us in a few quick, quiet steps, grabbed the strap of his equipment harness, and pulled him bodily off the railing and toward the group, using his own frozen weight against him with a technique that looked less like panic and more like something practiced, something drilled into muscle memory long before today. "Walk," she told him, low and firm. "Not run. Walk." Threll's claws trembled, but his legs obeyed her before his mind caught up, carrying him stumbling but upright back toward the retreating group. Colin's device crackled at his belt, a voice on the other end reporting that emergency response teams were scrambling but were still several minutes out, that the reserve's backup containment measures had failed to activate for reasons still under investigation, that we should retreat to the nearest secure structure and await further instructions. Nearest secure structure is the observation tower, Colin said, pointing ahead to a tall wooden structure rising above the walkway, its base reinforced with metal plating. It has a sealed door, reinforced walls. We can hold there until the response team arrives. That's exactly where it's pushing us, Mira said. What? The tower has one entrance, she said, her eyes flicking rapidly between the structure, the stalker, and the narrowing walkway ahead of us. One door. If we're all inside when it reaches us, we're trapped with no second option. If the door fails, or if it finds another way in, there's nowhere left to go. We don't have another option, Colin said, his voice rising with the particular desperation of someone realizing the plan he was counting on might be exactly wrong. We do, Mira said. But it means splitting the group, and someone needs to hold its attention long enough for the rest to reach the tower, and the door mechanism gets sealed properly before it arrives. The implication of what she was suggesting settled over me like cold water, and I saw the same understanding hit Colin's face a half-second later. Absolutely not, he said. I am not letting a student. I'm not asking permission, Mira said, and there was no cruelty in her voice. No desperate bravado either, only the same flat, practical calm she had carried since the fence first failed. I'm telling you what has the best chance of getting everyone else through that door alive. You can argue with me while it decides which one of us to reach first, or you can get the group moving. I do not know what expression was on my face in that moment, but Mira glanced at me briefly, and something in her look softened, just slightly, the first crack in that calm, controlled surface since the field had gone down. Kess, she said, get them to the tower. Help Colin with the door mechanism. I'll catch up. You can't be serious, I said. You'll be... I've done harder things than this, she said, and turned back toward the stalker before I could argue further, before I could point out that whatever hardship her species had endured on some faraway Deathworld had nothing to do with facing down an apex predator alone on an alien planet, with no weapon beyond a small multi-tool, and whatever instinct had taken hold of her. The Caro stalker's head swung toward her the moment she stepped away from the group, its heat-sensing gaze locking onto the single figure who had suddenly, deliberately, made herself the most interesting thing on the walkway. And Mira Bennett, quiet, mocked, and utterly unremarkable to every student who had laughed at her that morning, planted her feet, squared her shoulders, and did not run. I did not want to leave her. I want that understood clearly, because in the days that followed, when the story of what happened at the reserve spread through the academy, some students framed it as though the rest of us had simply abandoned a human girl to face a predator alone while we saved ourselves. That is not what happened. It only felt that way because Mira made the choice before any of us had time to argue properly, and because once she made it, arguing further would have wasted the only thing keeping the rest of the class alive, which was time. Colin grabbed my arm and pulled me forward, his own instincts finally overriding his hesitation, and together we half-pushed, half-guided the rest of the class along the walkway toward the observation tower. Oren kept glancing back over her shoulder, her pale scales gone almost white, and I did not blame her. I wanted to look back too. I forced myself not to, because Mira had given me a task, and some instinct in me, small and new and entirely unfamiliar, told me that failing that task would matter more than anything I might see if I turned around. Behind us, I heard Mira's voice, steady and unhurried, carrying across the open ground toward the stalker. "Here," she called out, not loudly, not desperately, but with the particular clarity of someone who wanted to be heard by exactly one listener. "Over here." The stalker's low growl rumbled across the reserve, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the wooden walkway itself, and I felt every hair on my body rise at once, a purely instinctive response that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with survival. We reached the tower within a minute that felt like an hour, and Colin fumbled with the door mechanism, a heavy reinforced panel that required both a manual code and a physical key housed in a small case bolted beside the frame. His hands were shaking too badly to manage the sequence. "Let me," I said, surprising myself with how steady my own voice came out, and took the key from his trembling fingers. My 4 eyes, whatever their other shortcomings, were good at fine detail work, and I fed the key into its slot and entered the code Colin recited to me in a rush, my claws moving with a precision I did not know I possessed until that moment. The door hissed open. Students poured through it in a ragged, frightened stream, Oren practically carrying a smaller Velkari boy who had gone limp with shock, Threll stumbling in near the back, his claws pressed white against the doorframe, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. I stood at the threshold, counting heads, and came up 1 short. "Where's Mira?" Colin asked, doing the same count, arriving at the same terrible number. I turned back toward the walkway, and what I saw stopped my breath entirely. The Caro stalker had abandoned its slow, patient stalking posture and closed the distance to Mira in a burst of terrifying speed, the kind of motion that made the earlier lecture about its adaptations feel like a dry academic footnote rather than the description of something now bearing down on a single, unarmed girl standing her ground on an open walkway. Mira did not run. She waited, watching its approach with the same flat focus she had carried since the fence first failed, and at the exact moment the creature closed the final distance, she moved sideways, fast and low, using the narrow gap between 2 support posts as a barrier, forcing the stalker to check its momentum or collide with solid wood. It checked its momentum, barely. Its shoulder clipped the post hard enough to shake the entire section of walkway, and the structure groaned under the impact, but it held, and Mira had already put another 10 meters between herself and the creature by the time it recovered. "She's using the posts," I said, mostly to myself, understanding dawning slowly. "She's not trying to outrun it. She's making it work for every meter." "That won't last," Colin said grimly. "It's faster than she is over any real distance. She's just delaying." "Delaying for what?" As if in answer, a new sound cut across the reserve, a rising mechanical whine, distant but growing, the unmistakable approach of aircraft. The emergency response team, arriving finally, minutes after Colin's call, minutes that had felt, to those of us waiting, like the longest stretch of time any of us had ever endured. But minutes, even a few of them, were still minutes Mira had to survive alone out there, and the stalker, having recovered from its collision with the post, was closing on her again, faster this time, its earlier patience burned away by frustration and hunger, and whatever primal calculation drove it to abandon caution. I do not know what made me step back out through the door. I have asked myself that question many times since, and I still do not have a clean answer beyond the fact that leaving her out there while I stood safely behind reinforced walls felt like a wrongness I could not tolerate, deeper than fear, deeper than the freezing instinct my species carries in its bones. "Kess, don't," Colin said, grabbing for my arm, but I was already moving, already through the doorway, already running back along the walkway toward the sound of the stalker's rising growl and Mira's steady, unafraid voice, still calling out to keep its attention locked on her. I am not brave. I want that understood as clearly as everything else in this account. Whatever I did next was not courage in the way humans seem to mean the word. It was closer to panic, channeled by accident into forward motion instead of the frozen stillness my body wanted. I grabbed the only tool within reach as I ran, a long observation pole used for adjusting overhead sensor equipment, and I do not know what I intended to do with it, beyond making noise and taking up space, but I swung it hard against the metal railing as I approached, sending a loud, ringing clatter across the open ground. The stalker's head swung toward the new sound, its attention splitting for one crucial second between Mira and the strange, noisy Doran suddenly barreling toward it with a pole in his shaking hands. That second was enough. Mira used it to close the distance to a maintenance junction box set into the walkway's support structure, one she had clearly marked earlier. During those long moments of quiet observation nobody else had understood the purpose of. She wrenched open its panel with her multi-tool and yanked a cable free, and the section of railing nearest the stalker's position crackled once with a burst of residual charge from the reserve's backup power system. Not enough to seriously harm the creature, but more than enough to startle it. An unfamiliar jolt of energy against sensitive skin, built for detecting heat and movement, not electricity. The stalker recoiled, snarling, shaking its head as if to clear the strange sensation, and in that moment of confusion, the response team's aircraft finally crested the tree line, spotlights sweeping across the reserve, a recall signal blaring from mounted speakers, a frequency specifically designed to override predator instincts imported for exactly this kind of controlled environment. The stalker froze, then turned, then retreated into the tree line with the same unhurried, powerful grace it had emerged with, as if the entire encounter had simply been an interruption to its evening rather than anything resembling a genuine threat neutralized. Silence settled over the reserve, broken only by the whine of the aircraft powering down and the ragged sound of my own breathing. Mira turned to look at me, her chest rising and falling with the first visible sign of exertion I had seen from her all day, and something in her expression shifted, the flat, focused calm cracking just slightly to reveal something more human underneath. Relief, maybe, or simple exhaustion. "You shouldn't have come back out here," she said. "You shouldn't have stayed out here alone in the first place," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the noise. It bought me the second I needed." "You had a plan the whole time," I said, still catching my breath. "The junction box. You saw it before any of this started, didn't you?" "I look for things like that," she said. "Cables, panels, anything that might matter later. It's just how I look at a place." Response team members reached us moments later, medics and security personnel swarming the walkway, checking both of us over, confirming no injuries beyond scrapes, and the general shaking that comes after adrenaline drains out of a body that has just survived something it was never built to face. Threll appeared at the tower doorway as we were escorted back, his claws still trembling slightly, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. He opened his mouth as we approached, closed it again, opened it a second time. "I froze," he said finally, quietly, to nobody in particular. "You told me to move and I just froze." "Most people do," Mira said, without judgment in her voice, without the satisfaction I half expected after the morning's mockery. "It's not something you choose. It's just what happens to a nervous system that's never had to learn otherwise." "But you didn't freeze," Threll said. "Why didn't you freeze?" Mira was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the tree line where the stalker had vanished, at the darkening sky beyond it, at the reserve that had nearly cost 40 students their safety through a single failed fence panel nobody had bothered to check twice. "Where I grew up," she said finally. "You learn early that freezing doesn't save you. Only moving does. Eventually your body stops asking your permission to move. It just does it." "That sounds like a terrible way to grow up," Oren said softly, having appeared beside us, her scales slowly regaining their normal color. "It is," Mira agreed. "And it isn't. It's just what made me able to help today, instead of freezing along with the rest of you. I don't know if that makes it worth it. I've never known how to weigh that kind of thing." The response team finished their checks and began organizing the class for transport back to the academy, and as the shuttle doors closed behind us minutes later, I found myself sitting once again across the aisle from Mira Bennett, the quiet human girl the entire class had mocked 8 hours earlier, who had just spent the longest, most terrifying minutes of my life, keeping 39 strangers alive through nothing more than careful attention and a refusal to let her own fear decide what her body would do. Nobody laughed at her on the ride home. Nobody said much of anything at all. The Academy investigated the fence failure for nearly 2 weeks afterward, and the official report, when it finally circulated, confirmed what Mira had suspected within seconds of noticing that first amber light. A cascading fault in the backup power relay had gone undetected by the central monitoring system, because the physical indicator panels ran on a separate, older circuit never properly integrated during the reserve's last upgrade. 3 redundant systems had failed within minutes of each other, not through malice or sabotage, but through the quiet, ordinary way that complex systems sometimes fail, each safeguard trusting the next one to catch what it missed. Colin kept his position at the reserve, though he later told me, during a chance meeting near the Academy's transit hub, that he thought about that afternoon every single day, and that he had personally insisted on a full manual inspection schedule for every physical indicator on the property from that point forward. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had put in a formal commendation for Mira with the reserve's administration, though she had apparently asked him not to make a public event out of it. That did not stop the story from spreading anyway. Stories rarely wait for permission. By the following week, the entire xenobiology class, and then most of the academy, had heard some version of what happened at the Aldrin Reserve. The details shifted, depending on who told them, growing more dramatic with each retelling, but the core of it stayed consistent enough that nobody who had actually been there bothered to correct the smaller exaggerations. A human girl had stood alone in front of an apex predator, using nothing but observation and quick thinking, and had bought her entire class the time they needed to reach safety. The change in how people treated her was subtle at first, and then not subtle at all. Students who had once avoided sitting near her began saving her seats instead. The same faces that had laughed along with Threll's mockery a few weeks earlier now offered small nods of acknowledgement when she passed them in the corridors, the kind of respect that comes without needing to be spoken aloud. Even Vashtu, our instructor, adjusted the following week's lesson plan to include a segment on Deathworld adaptive behavior that leaned heavily, if diplomatically, on details clearly drawn from the reserve incident, careful never to name Mira directly, but obvious enough to anyone who had been there. Threll changed the most, and the most awkwardly. He approached her nearly a week after the incident, during a break between classes, while I happened to be standing nearby collecting my things from a nearby desk. I do not think he noticed me at first, or perhaps he did not care. "I wanted to say something," he began, his claws clicking together in a nervous rhythm I had never seen from him before. "About what I said, before the reserve, about your species, about you." Mira looked up from her notebook, waiting, offering him nothing to work with, no easy exit from the discomfort of his own apology. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words coming out stiffly, like something physically difficult to produce. "I don't just mean about you specifically, I mean about the whole idea. I thought Deathworld meant weak, like your species survived by luck, the way I said in class. I watched you not freeze when I did. I watched you plan things out while the rest of us were just reacting. That's not luck. That's not weakness either." "No," Mira agreed simply. "It isn't." "I also wanted to say thank you," Threll continued, pushing through what was clearly one of the more difficult conversations of his young life. "For pulling me off that railing. I know I wasn't exactly kind to you before that. You didn't have to help me. You're in my class," Mira said, as though this were a complete and sufficient explanation. "We're going to be studying alongside each other for years. There wasn't really a version of that afternoon where I let something happen to you just because you'd been unpleasant a few hours earlier." Threll seemed to absorb this for a moment, clearly expecting either forgiveness or continued coldness, and receiving instead something more complicated and, I think, more honest than either. "I'm still going to try to be better," he said, "about all of it." "Good," Mira said, and returned to her notebook, though I caught the faintest softening around her eyes as he walked away, the closest thing to warmth I had seen from her toward him since the term began. I found myself thinking often, in the weeks that followed, about what the galaxy actually understood about humanity, and how much of that understanding turned out to be built on the wrong assumptions entirely. We had spent generations classifying Deathworld species by their physical toughness, their resistance to radiation or extreme temperature, their capacity to survive injuries that would end most other species outright. We had measured hardiness in scars and survival statistics, in the raw brutality of a planet's environment, and concluded, reasonably enough on paper, that humans occupied a middling position among such species, tougher than some, far more fragile than others. What we had failed to measure, because it does not show up on any physical scan or genetic survey, was the particular shape of a mind that had evolved not around raw physical toughness, but around vigilance, around the quiet, constant work of noticing, around a nervous system built, generation after generation, to keep functioning clearly and usefully in the exact moments when every instinct screamed to freeze instead. Mira had told me, on a later, quieter afternoon, when the reserve incident had faded into a story other students told rather than a memory the two of us relived, that humans called this hypervigilance, and that it was not something every human carried in equal measure, nor something anyone would call comfortable to live with. She had grown up, she explained carefully, choosing her words the way she seemed to choose everything, in a place where paying close attention to a room, a street, a set of exits, was simply the price of living somewhere unpredictable. It had cost her things, she admitted. Ease, rest. The simple pleasure of walking into a space without automatically cataloging every possible threat inside it. But it had also given her something the rest of us, raised on gentler worlds, simply did not possess in the same measure. A mind that did not need permission to act, that had already done the work of preparing for danger, long before danger ever arrived. "I don't think it makes me better than anyone," she told me, sitting on the edge of the Academy's observation deck one evening, watching the twin moons of our system rise over the campus. "I think it just means I grew up somewhere that asked something specific of me, and my body learned to answer that question before I was old enough to understand I was being asked it at all." "Do you wish you'd grown up somewhere else?" I asked. "Somewhere safer?" She considered this for a long moment, longer than she usually needed for any question I had asked her. "Sometimes," she admitted. "It would have been easier. I think about that sometimes, what it might feel like to walk into a room and just relax completely, the way you do, the way most people here do. I don't know what that feels like. I'm not sure I ever will. But I also know that if that fence hadn't gone down, if nothing had ever tested any of it, I'd have spent my whole life being the quiet human girl nobody noticed, the one people laughed at for jumping at loud noises, and none of you would ever have known what that quietness actually was. I think I'd rather be known for what I actually am, even if what I am came from somewhere difficult, than be underestimated forever by people who never bothered to ask." I thought about Threll's mockery in that classroom weeks earlier, about the laughter that had rolled over Mira like weather she had long since learned to ignore, and about how completely, how instantly, all of that had reversed the moment a fence failed and the class needed someone whose mind did not know how to freeze. The galaxy, I have come to believe, still largely misunderstands what a Deathworld actually produces. It imagines toughness measured in claws and scales and resistance to poison, and dismisses humanity as an afterthought, a soft species that got lucky, rather than one shaped, with brutal precision, by a planet that never stopped testing its people. It does not yet understand that the real adaptation, the one that matters most when containment fields fail and predators step into the open, is not found in muscle or hide at all. It is found in a mind that has already decided, long before the danger arrives, exactly what it will do when the moment finally comes. Mira Bennett never sought recognition for what happened at the Aldrin Reserve. She still sits quietly toward the back of our classes, still says little unless spoken to directly, still watches doors and windows out of a habit she has told me she may never fully unlearn. But nobody in that room mistakes her quiet for weakness anymore, and I suspect nobody ever will again. Because some of us come from worlds where nothing has ever truly threatened us, and we mistake that peace for strength. And some of us come from worlds that never stop trying to kill us, and somewhere in that struggle, without meaning to, without asking for it, We became something the rest of the galaxy has not yet learned to properly name. I know what to call it now. I watched it happen, close enough to feel the wind of it. It is called being human,